Greenwich Palace, September 1593. Picture this. You are standing in one of the most carefully guarded rooms in the known world. Oak panelling, leaded glass, the faint smell of rose water and candle wax. At the far end of the chamber, beneath a canopy of crimson velvet stitched with Tudor roses, sits Elizabeth I of England, the most powerful woman on the planet. She is 60 years old, her face a mask of white ceruse, her red wig framing a gaze that has stared down the Spanish Armada, ordered the execution of a fellow queen, and held together a fractious Protestant island by sheer political will, and walking toward her, unannounced by title, unrecognized by English law, uninvited by protocol, is a 63-year-old Irish woman in a travel-stained cloak. She has sailed from the west coast of Ireland, across waters she has controlled for 40 years, through English naval patrols that have tried and failed to sink her, and up the Thames to the seat of the empire that has spent decades trying to break her. Her name is Gráinne Ní Mháille. The English call her Grace O'Malley. The Irish call her the Pirate Queen of Connacht. And she has come not to surrender, but to negotiate. 2 queens, 2 empires, 1 room. And between them, a conversation reportedly conducted in Latin because neither would speak the other's language. This is the true story of that meeting, and the 40 years of piracy, warfare, and political maneuvering that made it possible. To understand Grace O'Malley, you have to understand the Ireland she was born into, because it was a country that, in the 1530s, existed in a state of dual reality. On paper, Ireland was an English lordship. Henry VIII had declared himself King of Ireland in 1541, extending the Tudor crown's claim over the entire island. In practice, English control barely extended beyond the Pale, a narrow strip of coastline around Dublin, fortified, garrisoned, and culturally English. Beyond the Pale, the old Gaelic order still held. Irish chieftains ruled by Brehon law. Land was held communally by the clan. Succession passed not from father to eldest son, but through tanistry. The clan elected the most capable male relative. Women could own property, divorce their husbands, and lead in war. This was the world of the O'Malleys. Their territory was the coast of County Mayo, in the far west of Connacht, a landscape of Atlantic cliffs, offshore islands, sheltered harbours, and some of the most dangerous waters in Europe. The O'Malleys had been seafarers for centuries. Their motto, Terra Marica Potens, powerful by land and sea, was not a boast. It was a job description. They fished, they traded, they taxed any vessel that passed through their waters, and when payment was refused, they took it by force. In English terms, they were pirates. In Gaelic terms, they were lords exercising their ancient maritime rights. Gráinne Ní Mháille was born around 1530, the daughter of Dubhdara, Black Oak, O'Malley, chieftain of the clan. The details of her childhood are largely legendary. The famous story of her cutting her hair short to be allowed aboard her father's ships, earning the nickname Gráinne Mháille, Bald Grace, is almost certainly folklore. What we do know from the state papers is that by the 1560s, she was already a figure of concern to English administrators in Connacht. She commanded a fleet. She controlled Clare Island and Clew Bay. She had married twice. First Donald O'Flaherty, through whom she gained control of his clan's castles after his death, and then Richard and Ieuan Bourke, whom she reportedly divorced under Brehon law after 1 year, keeping his castle of Rockfleet. The English were expanding. Under Elizabeth, the policy of surrender and re-grant, forcing Gaelic chieftains to surrender their lands and receive them back as English-style estates, with English titles, was being pushed deeper into Connacht. Sir Richard Bingham was appointed Governor of Connacht in 1584, and he saw the old Gaelic order not as a culture to be negotiated with, but as an obstacle to be crushed. Grace O'Malley was the obstacle he most wanted to crush. Grace's fleet was not what most people picture when they hear the word pirate. There were no 3-masted frigates, no rows of cannon, no skull and crossbones flags. This was 16th century Atlantic Ireland, and her vessels were galley-based, long, shallow draft rowing galleys with a single mast and square sail, designed for the sheltered waters of Clew Bay and the coastal channels of the west. The largest could carry up to 100 men, oarsmen and fighters combined, and were rowed with as many as 30 oars. They were fast, maneuverable, and ideally suited to hit-and-run attacks on merchant shipping. She reportedly commanded between 15 and 20 vessels at her peak, along with over 200 fighting men, a formidable private navy by any standard. Her bases were the fortified tower houses that dotted the Mayo coast, Rockfleet Castle on the southern shore of Clew Bay, Kildavnet on Achill Island, and Clare Island, which commanded the mouth of the bay itself. From these positions, she could control shipping lanes, shelter from pursuit, and launch raids along the entire western seaboard from Galway to Donegal. Her enemies were not only English. The Gaelic world was fiercely competitive, and Grace fought rival clans, the MacMahons, the Joyces, the Flahertys. With the same ferocity, she directed at English vessels. After the death of her first husband, Donal O'Flaherty, she reportedly took control of his strongholds by force, holding Hens Castle on Lough Corrib against a siege. But it was her relationship with the English that defined her career. Throughout the 1560s and 1570s, she alternated between resistance and negotiation, raiding English shipping and harbours, then offering her fleet services to the Crown when it suited her. In 1577, she was captured by the Earl of Desmond and imprisoned in Limerick and then Dublin Castle for 18 months, the first of several imprisonments. Each time, she negotiated her way out. Each time, she returned to the sea. The appointment of Sir Richard Bingham as Governor of Connacht in 1584 changed everything. Bingham was a military man, not a diplomat. He confiscated cattle, imprisoned Grace's sons, Tibbet and Murrow, and his brother Captain John Bingham had her eldest son Owen murdered during a military campaign in 1586. Bingham systematically dismantled the O'Malley power base. By 1593, Grace was in her 60s, impoverished, her fleet diminished, her family imprisoned or dead. She had been stripped of her cattle, the primary measure of wealth in Gaelic Ireland, and her authority over her clan was eroding. She had one move left, and it was audacious. In July 1593, Grace O'Malley did something no Gaelic chieftain had done before. She bypassed the entire English colonial administration in Ireland, the governors, the commissioners, the local lords, and wrote directly to Queen Elizabeth I. The document survives. It is held in the English state papers, and it is one of the most extraordinary petitions in Tudor history, known as the 18 Articles. It is a list of grievances and requests, written in formal English, presented with the careful structure of a legal brief. Grace described herself as a woman who had maintained herself by sea and land for 40 years, a phrase that, read between the lines, is a remarkably calm admission of 4 decades of piracy. She detailed Bingham's cruelties. She asked for the release of her sons. She asked for permission to continue her maintenance by sea, in other words, the right to keep doing what the English called piracy. Elizabeth's response was equally remarkable. Rather than dismissing the petition, she sent back a list of 18 interrogatories, formal questions, to be answered. Who was Grace's family? What lands did she claim? How had she maintained herself? The questions were specific, probing, and indicated genuine interest. Grace answered them, and the answers survive alongside the questions in the state papers. One of the most detailed first-person accounts of a Gaelic chieftain's life in the 16th century. And then Elizabeth invited her to court. The meeting took place at Greenwich Palace in September 1593. The details come from later accounts and tradition, rather than any official court record. No English scribe recorded the conversation, which is itself revealing. What we know is this: Grace and Elizabeth spoke in Latin, as Grace spoke no English and Elizabeth spoke no Irish. Grace reportedly refused to bow, on the grounds that she did not recognize Elizabeth as Queen of Ireland. According to tradition, she was offered a handkerchief, used it to blow her nose, and threw it in the fire. When told that in England one kept the handkerchief, She reportedly replied that in Ireland they had higher standards of hygiene. How much of this is true? The Latin conversation is plausible. Grace would have learned Latin from the religious education common to Gaelic noble families, and Elizabeth was famously fluent. The refusal to bow is consistent with the Gaelic view that an Irish chieftain owed no submission to the English crown. The handkerchief story is almost certainly folklore. It appears in too many other cultural encounter narratives to be trusted. But it endures because it captures something true about the meeting's dynamic. Two formidable women, each the supreme authority in her own world, meeting on terms that neither fully controlled. What is documented is the outcome. Elizabeth issued letters overriding Bingham's authority. Grace's sons were to be released. Her maintenance by sea was to be tolerated. Bingham was to cease his persecution. On paper, Grace had won. In practice, the victory was messier. Bingham dragged his feet on releasing the prisoners, and Grace reportedly returned to London in 1595 to press for compliance. Bingham was eventually recalled and stripped of his position, but Grace herself did not keep her side of the bargain either. She lent ships to Irish rebels under Hugh O'Neill at the outbreak of the 9 Years' War, even as she encouraged her son Tibet to fight for the crown. The meeting at Greenwich had changed the balance of power, but it had not resolved anything cleanly. Nothing in Grace O'Malley's life ever did. Here is where we have to be honest about what we know and what we don't. The primary documentary evidence for Grace O'Malley's life comes from 3 sources: the English state papers, the petition, the interrogatories, and official correspondence about her. The reports of English governors and administrators in Connacht, particularly Bingham's dispatches, and later folk traditions collected in the 18th and 19th centuries. There is no Gaelic primary source that records her life in her own tradition, a significant gap since the English sources view her entirely through the lens of colonial administration. The state papers are invaluable, but not neutral. They describe Grace's activities from the perspective of officials whose job was to pacify and Anglicize Ireland. When Bingham calls her a notable traitress and nurse of all rebellions, that tells us as much about Bingham's agenda as it does about Grace. When Grace describes herself in her petition as having lived by maintenance by sea and land, she is performing for an English audience, framing her piracy in terms Elizabeth could understand and potentially approve. The folk traditions are even more layered. The story of young Gráinne cutting her hair to join her father's crew is a narrative of defiance that may or may not have happened. The tale of her giving birth at sea and then rising from childbed to fight off Turkish, or in some versions, Barbary, pirates is almost certainly mythological, drawing on older Irish warrior woman archetypes. The handkerchief incident at Greenwich may be a later embellishment designed to assert Irish cultural superiority. What we can say with confidence is this: Grace O'Malley was a real historical figure who commanded a fleet, controlled territory, fought wars, was imprisoned multiple times, petitioned the Queen of England directly, and received concessions. The state papers confirm all of this. The scale of her operations, the number of ships, the geographic range, the duration of her career, places her among the most significant maritime figures in Irish history. The fact that she did all of this as a woman in a patriarchal world, navigating between 2 legal systems that both constrained female authority, makes her extraordinary by any measure. The irony is that the very sources that preserve her story are the sources of the power that tried to destroy her. We know Grace O'Malley primarily because the English wrote about her, and they wrote about her because she was a problem they could not solve. Grace O'Malley has become a cultural phenomenon far beyond what the historical record alone would support. And that gap between record and reputation is itself revealing. She appears in dozens of novels, from Morgan Llywelyn's Grania, 1986, to more recent young adult and fantasy treatments. The 2007 Broadway musical, The Pirate Queen, produced by the team behind Riverdance, dramatized her story with sweeping Celtic scores and a romanticized love story. In gaming, she has inspired characters in titles such as Amazon's New World, often depicted with anachronistic weapons and ships. The recurring pattern is the same: The historical complexity, the negotiations, the imprisonments, the compromises, the petty cruelties of colonial administration gets flattened into a simpler narrative of feminist defiance. This is not entirely wrong. Grace was defiant, but her defiance was strategic, not symbolic. She did not refuse to bow to Elizabeth as a feminist gesture. She refused because Gaelic law did not recognise Elizabeth's sovereignty. She did not petition the Queen as an act of protest. She petitioned because she had exhausted every other option and her family was being destroyed. The real Grace O'Malley is more interesting than the mythological one, because the real one had to make choices that the myth never acknowledges. Even the comparison to other pirate queens, Ching Shi, Anne Bonny, Mary Red, distorts more than it illuminates. Ching Shi commanded an enormous confederation in the South China Sea. Bonny and Red were crew members, not commanders. Grace was a Gaelic clan leader who used the sea as an instrument of territorial power. They operated in different centuries, different oceans, different legal and cultural systems. The category pirate queen is a modern invention that flattens all of them. Grace O'Malley died around 1603, the same year as Elizabeth. The coincidence is almost too perfect, and historians have noted it without being able to confirm the exact date. What we know is that by the end of her life, the Gaelic order she had spent a lifetime defending was collapsing. The 9 Years' War, the last great Gaelic resistance to English rule, ended in 1603 with the Treaty of Mellifont. The flight of the Earls in 1607 removed the last major Gaelic lords from Ireland. Within a generation, the world Grace had fought for was gone. And here is the deepest irony. Grace O'Malley survived in history not because the Gaelic world remembered her. The oral traditions that carried her story were fragmented by colonization, famine, and emigration, but because the English state wrote her down, the state papers, the interrogatories, the governors, dispatches. These are the documents of an empire cataloguing a threat. Every detail we know about her fleet, her castles, her marriages, her imprisonments, comes from people who were trying to control or destroy her. She was preserved by the filing system of her enemies, and the meeting at Greenwich, the climax of her story. The moment two queens sat across from each other and spoke in a dead language because neither would yield. That meeting produced no English record. No scribe noted the conversation. No courtier published a memoir. The most important encounter in Grace's life exists in history as a gap, an absence, a silence that later tradition filled with legends about handkerchiefs and hair and refusals to bow. We know it happened. The letters Elizabeth issued afterward prove it. But what was actually said between those two women, what they understood about each other, what they recognized, what they refused, is lost. Some stories survive because they are written down, and some survive because they are too powerful to forget, even when no one writes them down. Clew Bay, the west coast of Ireland. The light is always changing here, silver, then gold, then the deep Atlantic grey that swallows everything. There are 365 islands in this bay, or so the locals say, one for every day of the year. On Clare Island, at the mouth of the bay, there is a ruined Cistercian abbey where Grace O'Malley may or may not be buried. The ceiling bears a faded medieval painting of mythical animals and hunting scenes. The stone is cold. The wind comes off the Atlantic and never really stops. Rockfleet Castle still stands on the southern shore. 4 stories of grey limestone, a murder hole above the door, an iron chain ring where she reportedly tied her galley's mooring rope to her bedpost so she could feel the tide shift in her sleep. The tide still shifts. The castle still stands. The chain ring is still there. But the woman is gone. And the world she fought for, the Gaelic order, the Brehon law, the clan system, the maritime rights that made the O'Malleys lords of the Western Sea, all of it is gone. What remains is the silence at Greenwich. 2 women, 1 room, a conversation in a dead language that no one recorded. And the sea, always the sea.